Hello and welcome to the masterclass session of Intense Architecture, Rethinking Design, delivered by Professor Chris Smith as part of the University of Sydney's postgraduate masterclass series. My name is Firas Salan and I'm the Faculty Liaison Manager for the University of Sydney's School of Architecture, Design and Planning. Professor Chris Smith is co-director of Master of Architecture and Professor of Architectural Theory in the Sydney School of Architecture, Design and Planning at the University of Sydney. Chris has lectured internationally and involved in internationally renowned research. So just a bit of a housekeeping matter. So please post all your questions in the Q&A box in the Zoom platform at the bottom of your screen. The chat box won't be monitored, so please post all your questions in the Q&A box. So towards the end of the session, last 10 to 15 minutes, we will endeavor to respond to your inquiries. And I pass it on to Professor Chris Smith to start his session.
Welcome. As my colleague Ferris said, I'm Chris Smith. I'm a Professor of Architectural Theory within the Sydney School of Architecture, Design and Planning at the University of Sydney. This lecture sits in a series of lectures on the topic of intense architecture. And today I'm going to speak about one particular moment of intensity and intense architecture, an intense act that is the act of giving and the act of receiving, and often described as the act of generosity. So I have for some time now worked on body architecture relations, the way in which bodies and architectures compose one another. And most recently, I've been working on a book that explores the shared story of architecture and the development of the contemporary conception of the libido. This work aims at extending Michel Foucault's Care of the Self project toward a less parsimonious and more intense sense of care that might be engaged via the libido and via architecture. This is because it's a type of intense care or love that is as extensive of the outside as it is intensive of the inside. That is, I'm exploring forms of love and lust that are turned outward. To trace this movement in philosophy is to trace a slide from psychoanalysis and Marxism into post-structuralism. And it's there that the notion of the libido escapes investments in individual bodies, my body, your body, and comes to be explored in respect to all types of investment, all drives, all desires. The end game here is what the philosopher Gilles Deleuze and the psychoanalyst Felix Guattari call to make love with worlds. They commenced this project in their first collaborative text, Anti-Oedipus of 1972. Their philosophical move extends what we might have habitually considered to be an interior condition of the body, and they extend it outward, a care well beyond the self. In such an account, sexual desire and social desire, and here I'm talking about the desire that drives social movements and activisms, are considered to be two subcategories of libidinal investment. It is a movement where what Karl Marx refers to as, quote, the direct, natural and necessary relation of person to person is extended to a relationship between a person and people and communities, between communities and cultures, and on a very slightly different register, between people and other animals, people and objects, people and architectures and geographies. And that is between people and the world itself. But this story is not only one of care and forms of generosity. The libido is bound up in all manner of social investment, the good, the bad, and the ugly. In Anti-Oedipus, Deleuze and Guattari write that, quote, the truth is that sexuality is everywhere. The way a bureaucrat fondles his records, a judge administers justice, a business person causes money to circulate, the way the bourgeoisie fucks the proletariat, and so on, end quote. So I should clarify. I'm interested in that form of generosity that is operative in the social field. It's an index of actions, reactions, and revolutions, and that fails to abide by the rules or norms more often associated with things like charity or philanthropy, and instead relates to a much more singular expression of generosity. These singular expressions that are much more often associated with acts of sex and love. For Deleuze and Guattari, sexuality and love do not live in the bedroom of Oedipus. They dream instead of wide open spaces, end quote. And it is for this reason that I've titled this lecture, Generosity and Architecture's Wide Open Spaces. Today, I want to zoom in and look at a tight, logical, philosophical maneuver that helps us think about generosity and a particular moment of generous architecture, a moment of architecture's engagement with the wide open spaces of the sea. I will turn to the Kastrup sea bath that you can see pictured here. This is a sea bath, effectively like a bathing platform in the Øresund Sound, which flows between Denmark and Sweden. It's a structure conceived of by the Swedish architecture group White Arkitektur and was completed in 2004. This architecture constructs a sense of the inextricable intermingling of libidinal flows and currents, of selves, of bodies, of the social field, of a broader politics and a broader context for that politics, an architectural and urban and environmental play of politics, or what Isabel Stengers might call a cosmopolitics. This architecture presents a form of generosity where we forget ourselves in respect to, in proximity to, or with others and outsides. As such, I think of this architecture as a training ground for acts of love, acts of grace, acts that, quote, make love with worlds, unquote. I'm going to play this story out over 3 key movements that roughly accord to something like an ars politica, like a political art, a theoretical art, an ars theoretica, and an ars erotica, an erotic art, and talk about all 3 in terms of generosity, and I'll get to the point of discussing this particular sea bath and how it operates as a piece of generous architecture. But first to the ars politica, the problem of generosity. There is something quaint or courtly about generosity. It falls into discourses of dualism all too quickly, and one treats such discourses with much suspicion these days. When we talk about a dualism, what we're really talking about is discourses that are based on 2 things, right, left, good, bad, man, woman, etc., etc. They're dualistic discourses in the sense that they form themselves around 2 things. Okay. Generosity falls into discourse of givers and receivers, of socioeconomic dominance and subjugation, of bourgeoisie and proletariat, master and slave, north and south, privilege and poverty, etc., etc. Such discourses, dualistic or binary discourses, are problematic for advancing a thesis of generosity for 2 key reasons. Firstly, such discourses reinforce a value system which is economically reductive. It's reductive in the sense that dualistic accounts assume a banal accountancy of the act of generosity. This accountancy of generosity is simple enough to explain. It considers the loss incurred by givers alongside the equivalent gain of receivers. The dualism of giver and receiver is repeated in the mathematics of subtraction and addition. This accountancy seeks equilibriums from spreadsheets. It's a type of accountancy which suggests an equivalence between a loss and a gain. That is, that $1 that is given away here equals $1 gained there. Whilst the binary mathematics of generosity makes sense within the tight frame of an accountant's spreadsheet, it makes no sense beyond that same spreadsheet. The economies of generosity are far more dynamic than the quantitative economics might gauge. This logic has been provocatively critiqued by Georges Bataille in his work on excess, particularly in his text, The Accursed Share, an essay on general economy of 1967. Bataille rejects traditional versions of economic accountancy as he calls it limited. He laments that, quote, economic activity considered as a whole is conceived in terms of particular operations with limited ends, end quote. Instead, his ambition is to abandon the usual boundaries of economic analysis, to extend the question of economy to what he calls, quote, the play of living matter in general, end quote. Thus, what Bataille wants is for the spreadsheet of loss and gain to be blown wide open. In this manner, generosity would be conceived as belonging to the wider social cultural order. Bataille recognizes that a tax-deductible dollar given at a celebrity-filled charity ball in Hollywood has a very different value to a dollar received in a crammed full tent in a refugee camp in Bangladesh. There is often more pleasure involved in giving than in receiving, or indeed acts of generosity might involve moments of simultaneous pleasure, which makes generosity far more complex than any economically reductive, binary or quantitative account might acknowledge. And this leads me to the second key problem of the dualistic account of generosity. And this is perhaps the main problem, the real ars politica, the political art or political problem of generosity. My sense is that accounts of generosity framed in binary terms, okay, terms of the two, might reinforce the very conditions that they seek to remedy. The dualistic or binary giver, receiver, creditor, debtor, privilege, poverty is problematic because it's an account which reinforces the subjects of the act of generosity rather than the act itself. It is this point that I'm most interested in part because when Foucault refers to, quote, the fascism that causes us to love power, to desire the very thing that dominates and exploits us, end quote, I cannot but help think of the World Bank, the IMF, the UN, all those multinational global institutions with their philanthropic endeavours, and every charity ball and first world fundraising event, and all those institutions that work to ameliorate the effects of the very same multinational global regimes that they serve to perpetuate. But I'm getting ahead of myself here, and the story of the manner by which the dualistic construction of generosity might reinforce the very dualism it sought to cure is a story with considerable history. In Marcel Maus's groundbreaking work, The Gift, Forms and Functions of Exchange in Archaic Societies of 1950, the anthropologist and proto-sociologist draws our attention to the function of gift-giving in the maintenance of social orders. He would suggest that a social phenomena like gift-giving is, quote, not discrete. Each phenomenon contains all the threads of which the social fabric is composed, end quote. Maus makes it clear that any act in a social sense, and generosity and gift-giving are that, must not be treated in isolation from other social phenomena. In Maus's account, gift-giving, quote, implies giving something that is to be repaid, end quote. And, quote, the gift not yet repaid debases the person who accepted it, end quote. In this sense, every act of generosity, or what Maus calls the obligation to give, implies a hierarchy fused by the debt incurred. And it is the continual deferral of repayment, the ongoing debt, that sustains the social order. In such an account, we might imagine that every act of generosity contains the thread like the DNA of the social status quo, when it's that very same social status quo that we supposedly wanted to disrupt by the act of generosity. Thus, in such an account, we give not in order to disperse wealth, and value, but rather to protect the wealth and value we have. In today's broadsheet newspapers, this is often referred to in terms of soft politics. You know, it's the soft politics of foreign affairs and aid agendas. The wealthy economic North nations give money not to make the South wealthy, but to encourage behaviours that might perpetuate the North's own economic privilege and political dominance. And as we know, there's nothing flaccid about soft politics. The US makes love to Israel in its foreign aid budget, as it screws Palestine in that very same budget. Bataille had run with a similar point in his accounts of the function of excess. When Bataille extends the question of economy to, quote, the play of living matter in general, again, we get this type of delimiting of the act of generosity. It opens the account to a broader social field, a broader politics, a broader theoretics, and for Bataille, a broader erotics. But generosity is too specific a term here. For Bataille is interested in all acts that lubricate the social relation. In place of an exploration of balance, stability, and trade, this wide embrace leads to an exposition on excess, the manners by which excess is dealt. And in his book, The Accursed Share, excess could be excess time, excess energy, excess wealth, etc. Excess is accursed in the sense that it must be dealt with, lest it deals with us. Quote, for if we do not have the force to destroy the surplus energy ourselves, Bataille warns, it cannot be used. And like an unbroken animal that cannot be trained, it is the energy that destroys us. It is we who pay the price for the inevitable explosion. End quote. This conclusion is similar to that of Mauss. We give so that we might retain what we have. And for Bataille, if we fail to give, our excess threatens to destroy us. Whilst accounts such as that of Mauss and Bataille do much to make complex of the act of gift giving and generosity, they emphasize the necessities of the acts for the stabilization of the social system as a whole. Now, while stability might be considered in positive terms, stability of a system wherein poverty and trauma are entrenched seems problematic. And this leads us to what is perhaps the most cutting account of generosity, summated by Slavoj Žižek. Žižek's much publicized pronouncements on the dangerous perpetuations of the system of poverty, deep-rooted in capitalism, that are fostered by acts of charity should make us all take a step back. Perhaps most challenging for us is Žižek's conjoining of charity with what he calls objective violence. He defines objective violence as the, quote, violence caused by the functioning of today's global system itself, the same system we all operate in. In this case, generosity operates in a complicated network of forces and everyday effects that may collectively and in the end operate as forces of subjugation and violence. Žižek is clear in naming charity and philanthropy as systemic to the cynical functioning of the system. And it's a challenging thought. In Žižek's account, generosity comes to be defined as something akin to a minor corrective that helps to perpetuate unwarranted privilege. Such a critique, such a biting critique, is not a critique of the aims or sentiment behind generosity, but rather a critique of the outcomes and affect of the act in a broader socio-political field. In many ways, Žižek is repeating the story of Mauss and Bataille and Foucault in noting the manner by which we might come, quote, to desire the very thing that dominates and exploits us, end quote. And in short, this is the ars politica of generosity. This may be the problem of generosity, but I suspect it's the problem of any binary or dualistic construction of anything whatsoever. That is, when we take any dualistic construction, the dualism of giver and receiver, or creditor and debtor, is the case in point, we might suggest that the dualism reinforces the divisions, the inequalities it often seeks to appease. And this leads me to part 2, the ars theoretica, which is looking for a way forward given all of these problems. And particularly, I want to turn to the question of what's known as transversality. Whilst Mauss's account emphasizes the point that acts of generosity, quote, give two sides an identity, and thus reinforce or perpetuate the disparity that generosity might be framed against, Mauss also opens the doors to a richer account of generosity. In The Gift, in a section on rules of generosity, Mauss notes how in acts of generosity, quote, sentiments and persons are intermingled. This confusion of personalities and things is precisely the mark of exchange contracts, end quote. We might note such an intermingling of sentiments and persons and confusions of personalities and things in simple moments of generosity. When I was initially thinking about the way architecture might be generous, I was in Cardiff in Wales a few years back. I was walking down a street from the edge of the city upwards towards the university, and from around a corner, a man emerged, a Welsh man, mid-50s, short, medium build, sort of stocky, but quite a beautiful man, stocky, beautiful man, beautiful dark hair and complexion. And he was wearing this incredible suit. And it was a 3-piece suit in this acid blue checkered tweed. And I tend to, as you can see, I always tend to wear black. And this man's suit seemed to get brighter as he got closer and closer. And then there was a moment when we were just about to, or just passing each other by, and I was completely overcome by the fabric, and my mouth opened, and I said, "That is a beautiful suit." And it's a moment of generosity. These moments always involve a type of vulnerability. I didn't know whether he'd hit me or think that I was being sarcastic, or whether he'd overreact in a positive way, or whether he'd even understand my accent. As it was, he turned as we'd passed each other and said, "Thank you," and beamed an incredible smile which even outshone his suit. And it filled me with joy as I kept walking. And moments of generosity are often like this. They're confusions of sentiments, of pleasure, of vulnerability and joy, and they're interminglings of sensations, of color and intensive qualities, the intonation of words, personality, smiles, and streets. And it occurs to me that generosity involves all these things woven together in something that is woven so tightly, much like a checkered tweed. When Mauss makes his point on the intermingling and confusions of generosity, he draws on the work of Alfred Radcliffe Brown, the English sociologist, but he may just as easily have drawn on Marx. In the introductory pages of Capital, Marx would note, quote, "a definite social relation between men that assumes in their eyes the fantastic form of a relation between things." This intermingling and confusion, this fantastic form of a relation between people, sentiments, and things, any things, exceeds the account of generosity as a dualism of creditor and debtors, haves and have-nots. This richer sense whereby generosity operates as an open field where bodies and behaviors, communities and social structures are intermingled and confused is elaborated in the work of Mauss, and then into the work of Herbert Marcuse and his Frankfurt School colleagues, and then into post-structuralism, feminism, and queer theory, all those isms ever interested in the destruction of the dualism. In the work of Deleuze and Guattari, the philosopher and psychoanalyst, the term transversal is used to describe such an intermingling that complicates what we might habitually have thought of in terms of dualistic or binary constructs. Transversality comes to operate as a way of negotiating dualisms in two key manners. Firstly, it operates to confuse terms that often existed in opposition or barely related one to the other. It is transversality that is in operation when Deleuze and Guattari come to speak of a geology of morals, or of an ethico-aesthetics, or of desiring machines. And it is transversality that allows us now to speak of capitalism and schizophrenia in the same panting breath. And it is transversality that is activated when Deleuze and Guattari suggest that a signifier, quote, makes love with its signified, end quote. Transversality is an intermingling of that which we once treated as separate categories. Deleuze and Guattari would parenthetically give the very example of that intermingling that I'm most interested in when they write of, quote, transversals between the two, since social symbolism can become a sexual material and sexuality a ritual of social aggregation, end quote. This is the transversality of the social and sex, of what Foucault refers to in the preface to Anti-Oedipus as, quote, Marx and Freud in the same incandescent light, end quote. The philosopher and psychoanalyst Deleuze and Guattari operate transversely when they find sex in the social field, and the social field in acts of sex, when they speak of, quote, the primacy of the social field as the terminus of the investment of desire, end quote. Or likewise, when they find, quote, sexuality is everywhere, the way the bourgeoisie fucks the proletariat, and so on, end quote. There is in transversality an intense intermingling and confusion of terms that ordinarily related via dualistic or binary constructs. Secondly, transversality operates by affirming that which moves between any binary construct, by prioritizing or privileging the line that passes through the terms of the dualism. In geometry, the word transversal tends to refer to the line which cuts two other lines. Often the lines that are transversed are parallel and have no point of concurrence. That is, they operate like two sides of a dualism running alongside each other without ever meeting. The transversal line cuts through these two parallel lines, okay? Whilst in geometry, a transversal might be abstract and defined by the two lines through which it passes, in the work of Deleuze and Guattari, all that is abstract is operative, and the transversal takes precedent. What is affirmed in transversality is not the two parallel lines, but that which runs between. The logic is easy enough to explain and can be done in reference to all manner of mathematical, geographic, cultural, or social formation, including the act of generosity. It works a little like this. We can take any dualism that we habitually or traditionally tend to engage, man, woman, good, bad, left, right, etc. Okay, we'll take left and right and we'll imagine them as the left and the right banks of a river, for example. We can imagine that the left and the right banks come first, and that these two sides, this dualism, makes the river. For Deleuze and Guattari, operating in this way, however, is odd. The left bank and the right bank of a river do not make the river. It is the river that generates the left and the right banks. The dualism here, left and right, is constructed in the very act of the passing or the flow of the river. It is the river which generates the two sides and not vice versa. For Deleuze and Guattari, it is that which passes between that generates the binary. One more example, the sexes. Traditionally, we may have imagined that there were two sexes. Who'd have thought? The masculine and the feminine. And that there's a gap between one and the other, like two opposing lines that never touch. again, for Deleuze and Guattari, operating dualistically is highly problematic and nonsensical. And we should turn our attention to the transversal, that which passes between. In the case of the sexes, what passes between the masculine and the feminine binary, what transes is sexuality, the libidinal flow. It is the transversal nature of sexuality, often erroneously framed around notions related to giving and receiving, that leads Deleuze and Guattari to speak of, quote, not one or even two sexes, but n sexes, end quote. For Deleuze and Guattari then, quote, making love is not just becoming as one or even two, but becoming as 100,000. Indeed, Guattari, at the time of the publication of Anti-Oedipus, ups the ante in writing elsewhere of 3 billion perverts. The transversal is thus the zone between indistinct entities that are formed in the very wake of the movement. In short, the ars theoretica, here the transversal move escapes the operation of habitual dualisms and affirms that which passes between. Generosity in this sense is not constituted by those that give nor those that receive. What is privileged or affirmed in transversality is that which flows between. And when I think about generosity, what operates between the pleasures and vulnerabilities of giving and the pleasure and vulnerability of receiving is just that, a vulnerable pleasure, the anxious pleasure of coming to an edge and giving over something of ourselves and receiving something of others. In every act of generosity, the giver and the receiver are made precarious, left in the wake of the surging river. In the very act of generosity, the pleasure and vulnerability of generosity constructs its subjects, quote, in a confusion of personalities and things, as Mauss suggests. In this sense, there would be 1,000 generosities and likely 3 billion ways to make love with worlds. Now turning to the architecture of this, an ars erotica. Architecture has a very long history of what Zizek refers to as objective violence, of building the monuments of global capitalism and alongside them the institutions of altruistic intent that are equally the institutions of repression and subjugation, churches, prisons, schools, shopping malls. Architecture also has a long history of being complicit in reinforcing the boundaries of private property. And far too many of us are designing extensions to already extensive private homes or designing weekend destinations for the grossly over-remunerated. And sometimes it can seem that all our heroes of the 70s and 80s are now detailing outlets for Prada, and our best educational institutions are producing designers who are, quote, falling over each other to kiss corporate arse, end quote, as Philippe Starck so politely said. And sometimes it seems that every government and so-called social institution is screwing our public places. Every local council seems to be in bed with developers, every street now voyeuristically consumed by CCTV, and every bench in every public place is now specifically designed to disrupt the sleep of the homeless. Despite this long and dire history, architecture too has a minor line that might be thought of as generous, and it's this architecture I've come to love. Architecture can also foster the types of moments that compromise the bounds that we traditionally associate with the bourgeoisie and its privatizations, and instead might expose us to others and outsides. The architecture I want to talk of today is odd. It's unlikely in some senses. It's not an orphanage or a refugee camp. It's not an architecture of the ars politica or theoretica, but rather of the ars erotica. It's like a number of works of public architecture concerned with generosity, but not blatantly so. There's nothing charitable or philanthropic about this architecture, but it is an architecture that I think of as the training ground for generous acts, operating like a sex therapist for the cosmos. It's an architecture of wide open spaces, an architecture that might help us to make love with worlds. I turn to the Surbad, the sea bath. This sea bath, pictured here, sits in the Øresund Sound, the water you can see. I had suggested earlier that the Øresund flows between Denmark and Sweden, and this is not true. The Øresund does not run between Denmark and Sweden. It runs from one sea to another, between the North Sea and the Atlantic to the north, not surprisingly, and the Baltic Sea to the south. The Øresund has carved out a zone between the territories of Denmark and Sweden. Indeed, in many ways, in all ways, this waterway came first. It made the two. The sea bath sits in the gentle waves. The waves of the Øresund are gentle, and the structure curls up across the horizon line toward the sky, as you can see. The structure reminds me of the industrial wharves of my youth, heavy, functional structures of thick timber where goods are unloaded and people are brought to an edge. All acts of exchange and trade, including those of gift-giving and generosity, involve people arriving at an edge. The edge that brings us in contact with the other and the outside, the foreigner and the foreign. This architecture marks an edge, but it's a thoughtfully constructed and tentatively frayed edge. This is an architecture of exposed framing, triangulated framing, and candid expression of structure. It's also an architecture attentive to connections. There is here a constructional pragmatic that makes you imagine the structure was a joy to build with simple tools. That being said, the timber of the structure is extremely hard and dense. It's an African timber of the near extinct species Azobe, or what is sometimes called Eki. It comes from the Congo Basin, a long way from here by almost every possible measure. I imagine these timbers were shipped over the bridge in the distance. You might be able to just make out the bridge here. This bridge, for those of you who watch Nordic noir crime, is the bridge of the bridge fame. This bridge in the distance is the same bridge that in recent years became a site where travel documents are checked in response to what is quizzically known here as the European refugee crisis. Generosity is always a complex thing, always partial, fragmented, and sometimes to receive here is to lose from there. There's a particular process of abandonment that commences along the promenade that runs around the western edge of the Øresund. Bikes have been abandoned, as have bags of what you assume now hold clothing. These things have been abandoned by bodies that now lie on the beach and on the sea bath, on the structure itself, draining the day of vitamin D. From the promenade, a timber jetty extends. You can see the jetty that runs down here into the structure. The jetty is of the same slow-grain timber of the main structure. A steel balustrade runs along one side, and to the other runs long timber benches of a kind. These benches are occupied by bodies and towels. The jetty extends approximately 100 meters from the promenade east-northeast into the Øresund. Along this jetty lies a procession of stainless steel ladders that allow people to climb down into the water or up out of it. This jetty sits about 1 meter above the water, and here the tide varies very little. The current of the Øresund runs both northbound and southbound here. Not at the same time, it swings gently from one to the other over days. Today, the surface stream is southbound, and you see a naked child on an inflatable duck drifting slowly toward the Baltic. A large portion of the pleasure of this place is the denuded structures and bodies, architecture and bodies that are uncloaked and raw, having abandoned much of the accoutrement and paraphernalia that we often encase both within. And the pleasure and vulnerability fostered by this abandonment is palpable. pulsing like the waves, warm like the sun, and is accompanied by the sounds of laughter, and joyous bodies lie, sit, huddle, jump, splash about, and slowly drift away from parents. The architecture of jetties has always fascinated me, largely because it's an architecture that recedes. That is, it's an architecture that is not object in and of itself, as much as it is an architecture that promises its own demise. This architecture is a gift in the sense that what it is secondary to what it does. Like a gift, it brings us into contact with others and outsides, and like a gift, it is itself often beside the point. Mauss would note that what a gift is not nearly as important as what a gift does. But what it does is not a question of banal functionalism. We are drawn to jetties not for the utility of them, and not because we want the jetty itself, but because we want its end. Its role is to recede. We want to sit at the end of a jetty, to hang our feet over the end, and not to see it at all. What we want of a jetty is for it to disappear. The architecture of jetties is rarely ostentatious and loud. A jetty does not attempt to assert its order over the chaos of the sea, but rather promises its own end. It strikes me that in producing an architecture to disappear is to produce generous architecture, an architecture which does generosity. The end of this particular jetty, however, is not the end of the architecture. It sits at its center, but it's the center of a pier structure that moves, that frays about it. What is circular in plan spirals around us in perspective, and it is a structure, this structure here, that is breaking down or breaking away. That is, the pier of decks and sheltering walls, change rooms and steps and diving platforms that swirls around this center point is also receding. Whilst the exterior of this pier from the outside reminded me of the industrial wharves of my youth, the timber which lines the frame does not aim to protect the architecture itself, but rather to tentatively hold bodies that occupy it. The architects would suggest that this inside is like, quote, the mother of pearl, end quote, for its, quote, smooth, round shapes inside where people are, end quote. I'm reminded that mother of pearl is both organic and inorganic, a composite and confusion of bodies and architecture. It is also a glorious weaving of sexes with hermaphrodite characteristics and ambosexual mobilities. A mother of pearl, it seems, can also be a father, and its sexual capacities swing like the direction of the currents here, gently from one to the other over days. I'm quite certain that this is not what the architects were suggesting when they used the term mother of pearl, but I'm equally certain that this is a characteristic of the architecture here in the Öresund. The doors of the change rooms indicate male and female, the masculine and feminine, in adjacency, but the remainder of the structure seems to negate the categories and accommodate all bodies gloriously together. The decks and arched walls of the outside of the sea bath are lined with vertical timbers that break the wind and catch the sweep of the sun as the earth itself turns. These vertical timbers are in turn lined by bodies, less vertical and more mobile. Bodies migrate across the afternoon around the interior of the sea bath, following the sun, or using the structure to warm one side or the other. The breeze tends to come from the west at this time of year, and even when your body is wet, the structure does a marvelous job of keeping you warm and out of the wind. The simplicity of the geometry of this structure, like utilitarian descriptions of its function, belie the richness of the encounter. The confusion of personalities and things that for Mauss, quote, is precisely the mark of exchange contracts, end quote, is the same confusion that marks generous architecture. For Deleuze and Guattari, quote, the desiring sexual relationships of man and woman, or of man and man, or woman and woman, the index of social relationships between people, end quote. I think this architecture is also an index of a social fabric, or a relationship between people, but also of broader, wider relations between people and cultures, cultures and places, between people and wide open spaces. This architecture is a structure that loves other structures, the migrations of the sun, or rather the turning of the earth, the gentlest pull of the moon, the switching drift of the currents, the breeze, and the gently pulsing waves. It's an architecture that also loves the structure of other bodies. When the distinct otherness of the sea itself is the point, then macro-political classifications of the swarm that temporarily inhabit this structure seem minor, pleasurable but minor. The point coincides with Foucault's care for the self project, which comes to speak of a care not as a way of looking after the self in a broader social context, but of aligning or weaving broader contexts with the pleasures that one seeks and enjoys, a concerted fraying and reweaving of the social fabric itself. Like most people here on this sea bath on this day, I'm not here for the architecture or the water, or any one person in particular, or even the sun, it's shining elsewhere. I'm here somewhere between Denmark and Sweden because it all comes together here, is woven here in a manner, that voluptuous manner, that makes this place a very generous ars erotica. The sea bath recedes and frays no more powerfully than here, right here at the end of the structure, at the diving platform to the south. Here, the timber frays and the framing structure is exposed, and then the structure also frays and ends. It is often at the point of fraying where we notice the weave of a fabric, a material, a social fabric, a tweed, an architecture. It is at this point of fraying that we appreciate most the effort involved in this generous architecture, the effort to, quote, draw together in order to reweave intermittent and opposite fragments, end quote. At this most frayed edge, we are brought most intensely to the Öresund. The framing structure ends at a point of vulnerability and pleasure. Here, bodies are brought to the edge and they leap from either 3 or 5 meters above the sea. The structure here is denuded and precarious, as denuded and as precarious as the bodies. These are the bodies of the brave and the vulnerable. They step away from their friends and lovers for a moment, away from the social fabric that bound them and the architecture that held them. They've shed inhibitions. They breathe in deeply and take to the air and then the sea. Instead of habitually considering generosity in the binary terms of giver and receiver, and the dualistic or more often than not ideological politics that the binary implies, we can instead privilege or affirm that which passes between. What I think operates between the pleasures and the vulnerabilities of giving and receiving in acts of generosity is just that, pleasure and vulnerability. And it is the nature of this precarious pleasure that might be a better starting point for any consideration of generous architecture. Life is replete with moments of pleasure and generosity, moments where we give, moments when we receive, moments where parts of us give and other parts receive. In sexual generosity, surely the high point is moments when you forget the binary two, where you forget where you end and a lover begins. These are moments where the macro politics of the art or the ars politica of generosity are swept away in micro pleasures. Moments where selves care for others and outsides. Moments in which we might joyously and collectively make love with worlds. And we must remember that architectures, generous architectures, can open us not only to others, other bodies, other sexes, other people, but also to outsides. As Deleuze and Guattari would note, quote, sexuality and love do not live in the bedroom of Oedipus. They dream instead of wide, open spaces. Thank you.